How to get your gut bacteria to improve, unlocking the best strategies for a healthy gut. Gut bacteria change the game as it pertains to nutrition for us. So historically, when we think about nutrition, we think of how much of what? How much protein do we need every day? How much vitamin B12 do we need every day? How much magnesium do we need every day? Gut bacteria, they make this situation far more complex, both because their metabolism is different than ours. They sport a completely different set of genes than we do, but also where they're located. Most of our gut microbiome and the bacteria that reside within it are in our colon, which is at the very end of our gastrointestinal tract. So we have to get these nutrients to them. So basically, we eat our food, we extract what we need from that food, and then what's left over, we'll make it into the colon, and that will feed the bacteria that are within our microbiome. They then take this food, they ferment it, change it up, biotransform it, and create metabolites that have a very diverse effect on many factors. So for example, some of these metabolic byproducts are going to regulate the other bacteria that are within the colon. So if bacteria kind of takes fiber and transforms it into something else, that something else may be consumed by other members of the microbiome. And additionally, some of these metabolites affect the health of our colon, which will again shape what microbes live there. They'll impact our immune system, they'll impact our metabolism, and they'll also enter our systemic and circulation and impact how our overall health is. So things such as our mood, muscle action, bone density, metabolism, immune function. So these microbes are playing a really important role in our health. They contain bacterial genes that we simply do not have in our own genome, and they also kind of work together to create this kind of second genome within our body that helps us access nutrients that we can't necessarily access and helps us kind of overall become healthy. So we can't just now focus on how much of vitamin B12 or how much magnesium do we need. We have to focus on what does our gut bacteria need and how can we get that from our mouth to our colon intact so that it can feed our gut bacteria and it can make us healthy. So as I just mentioned, most of the microbiome is found in the colon, about 90 to 95% of it. The second most kind of populated area is our mouth, and that is actually quite substantially more than what we find in the stomach and the small intestine and throughout. There are microbes everywhere. There are microbes throughout your entire digestive tract, including the stomach, where you mix acid to kind of suppress their numbers. You have them on your skin, in your mouth, in your eyes, in your ears, on your hair. Everywhere throughout your body, there are microbes everywhere. So we are focusing specifically on the gut microbiome, but realize that you are simply just one giant set of microbiomes that regulate local conditions. So the skin microbiome regulates the health of the skin. The gut microbiome regulates the health of the gut. We're going to focus on that gut microbiome here just for simple and ease, and most people are kind of familiar with it. But what is important for our gut microbiome? They're going to adapt to what we eat and what we do. So things such as our diet, how much alcohol we consume, whether we're getting enough sleep, how good our oral health is, because the bacteria that are in our oral cavity are going to seed the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. Exercise is also going to have an important impact on our microbiome. And what's going to happen is this kind of lifestyle-driven environmental change is going to shape our microbiome to be either healthy, unhealthy, or somewhere in between. And this microbiome is going to associate with disease states. Now, it's important to point out that this doesn't necessarily mean that the microbiome is causing the disease. The disease could be causing the microbiome. In other words, kind of think of like a tomato. If you just kind of have a tomato sitting on your countertop fully intact, it's relatively healthy. But if you let it sit for a while, since it's essentially dead, it's no longer in the ground, eventually it's going to be overtaken by different microbes than what would promote health, and you're going to see the tomato eventually kind of decay. So in that way, we can't really assume that this microbiome is driving disease. It does seem that it's kind of a two-way street. Good health promotes a healthy microbiome, and a healthy microbiome will promote good health. But a lot of people are kind of looking at this microbiome picture as, oh, I got type 2 diabetes or fatty liver. All I need to do is kind of just take a bunch of the microbes that live in a healthy microbiome and that will fix the problem. That is not the case. That is not what's going to happen. You're not going to be able to take a suite of probiotics that are going to cure type 2 diabetes. That's simply not going to happen. So it's probably not something you should really wait for. Instead, you kind of want to create this synergy between your healthy lifestyle and that of your microbiome, using diet as the primary lever, but also focusing on these other factors that I mentioned. And what you get with a healthy microbiome is a diverse set of roles throughout the body. They regulate immune function, mood, cognition, metabolism, digestion, of course, your access to nutrients. So there's certain nutrients that we can't access that the microbiome can liberate. So it's just, they do so much for us. They help promote colon health, which will promote overall health and help keep systemic inflammation low. So this microbiome is really important for our health. They are effectively a second genome that doesn't actually belong to us, but helps us access things within the environment that can make us healthy, or alternatively can promote disease. Since the majority of the microbiome is in our colon, we have to kind of feed them. We have to figure out how to feed them. It's not as simple as, okay, I'm getting 400 milligrams of magnesium, which is my daily need. How do you get magnesium into the microbiome? Because, just like we use minerals and vitamins to metabolize our food, the microbiome does the same thing. So we really need to deliver nutrients to the colon so that our microbiome can actually do what it's supposed to do. So the individual members of the microbiome have what they need to process the nutrients that are left over. So there are kind of two conceptual ways to look at this, the delivery of nutrients to the colon. The first one, you can consume foods that deliver nutrients to the colon. In other words, they're less bioavailable to us. We can't break them down. They're still kind of sitting in there when they get to the colon, and that makes them more bioavailable to the members of our microbiome. And additionally, it's important to point out that we want to think of this as within a food matrix. So if you think about, say, a standard meal, all of that food is locked up within a food matrix. That food matrix essentially slowly delivers the nutrients, some to us, some to the microbiome. And when it's not in this food matrix, so think of kind of like a shake where you just take all of the individual components of food and put them in there. Those are immediately bioavailable to us. We don't need to break them down. And so they're probably not going to make it with all the way to the colon intact. So they're not really going to be bioavailable to our microbiome. So it's important to think of this as kind of a whole foods approach where you are taking a whole food and it's just slowly getting broken down. Some of it's going to be absorbed by us. Some of it's going to be absorbed by our microbiome. Whereas if we just took this and made an ultra processed shake, what you're going to get is simply just something that's completely bioavailable to us, and we're going to take what we need. The second approach is consuming larger amounts of other foods. So in other words, when we consume certain foods, we're going to get these nutrients, micronutrients, minerals, macronutrients, and we're only going to be able to break down and absorb a certain amount. They may or may not be in a food matrix. So if you're kind of thinking this conceptually, think about, a processed food that you may get at the store. I mean, there are a million of them. They're made more bioavailable to us, which means there's going to be less bioavailable to our microbiome, which means they're only getting the scraps, they're only getting the leftovers. But there are potential negative consequences to this, some of which are centered around other nutrients that need to be overconsumed with these nutrients to get them there to the colonic microbiome, and that can have detrimental effects to us. We have to consider that. That's definitely not something you want to ignore, and so that is going to bring us to an excellent review on the topic of how what is considered a healthy eating pattern affects our microbiome. Before we jump into the new review, we have some caveats. And those are, first, what we know is limited. It's really difficult to do studies in humans based on diet because, in order to get a good study, you're really going to have to lock a person away into a metabolic ward and regulate everything they do. People don't want to do that, and people are certainly not going to do that long term. So what we have to look at is human outcome data, how different nutritional interventions affect the microbiome, what metabolic byproducts are created by that microbiome, and how all of this associates to disease. And so for example, we need to look at how do certain dietary patterns affect outcomes in humans. How do they affect colon cancer risk? How do they affect heart disease risk? How do they affect longevity and things of that nature? And then we got to look at what happens when we feed these foods to humans or animal models. For example, if we feed fiber, what do we see that the gut microbiome makes from this fiber? What do these individual byproducts do when we feed them to animal models? And so in order to get a comprehensive overview of what a healthy dietary pattern does and creates in terms of a microbiome and how that associates to disease, we really have to take a bunch of small pictures and try to combine them together to make one overall big picture. Clearly, that's not ideal as, say, like taking, a group of 50 humans and locking them away for the rest of their lives and feeding them different diets and seeing how it affects them. But that's simply not going to happen. We're never going to get a clear picture from or at least as comprehensive as that. It's simply not going to work. The next caveat is there is no universal healthy microbiome. It is likely going to vary between individuals. Think of the microbiome as a fingerprint. It's going to be specific to you. That being said, we can look at a population level, what is generally seen in healthy people, what is generally seen in people who have healthy outcomes, what markers from the microbiome tend to predict these outcomes. And so we could get it at a population level, we can see what generally is healthy to most humans. That being said, that might not necessarily be what's healthy for you. What's healthy for most humans may cause bloating for you, may cause you to feel nauseous, may cause you not to feel so good. So it's really important to, even though we're looking at this population data, to realize that you are an individual within that population and you may not be sitting at the top of that bell curve. So you really need to find out what works right for you. So it's not as simple as, hey, this study says I should eat XYZ, so I'm just going to eat XYZ. It's going to be, this study says eat XYZ, so I'm going to start eating XYZ, find out what works for me. Maybe I have to take out Z, maybe I have to take out Y, and then I'll add in A, B, or C to find out a diet that works great for me. Then you want to look at lab work, other outcome data in yourself, and see what your dietary patterns are doing for you. And you'll have the microbiome that kind of tags along with that. It's also important to point out that there may be exceptions. So when we're looking at this population data, this is generally looking at a diverse omnivorous diet that's not really restricted in certain things, but we may have diets that are exceptions to the rule. So for example, low carb diets may be an exception. Keto diets, carnivore diet, they may be exceptions. However, it's important to point out that we just don't know. So it's really important to understand how different dietary strategies affect the microbiome and how the metabolites from this microbiome may impact our long-term health. This brings us to what is currently the most comprehensive review on how the overall dietary pattern and individual components within the dietary pattern affect the microbiome. The name of the review paper is Rethinking Healthy Eating in Light of the Gut Microbiome by Anissa Arma et al. I will put the link to the review in the description below. Highly recommend you read it. It is open access, and we'll post the open access link below so that you can access it. A lot of information. It's certainly not something we can cover comprehensively in a short video, but it is an amazing review and will help you understand how different components within the diet can affect our health and our microbiome. This review paper asks a really important question. How do different national guidelines based on the diet affect the gut microbiome? Now, it's important to point out that how are these national guidelines developed? They're based on all of the human outcome data. what foods within the diet tend to promote health. And they're nearly universal in developed countries. So Japan's recommendations are not that much different from the United States, same the UK and many of the countries in Europe. But we do get very different health outcomes. And we see some of these things kind of travel along. So for example, in the United States, most people do not follow the nutritional guidelines. Most people eat a lot of processed food. They eat out a lot at different restaurants. They're not following the nutritional guidelines, so you wouldn't expect them to get healthy outcomes if the guidelines are based on healthy outcomes. But we are exporting our bad dietary principles to other countries. Obesity is increasing in Japan. That's not because they've changed their nutritional guidelines. They haven't. That's because the modernization of the food industry, of the food environment within Japan is more coming to resemble what's in the United States, same in the UK and throughout. So it's important to understand that even though there's a lot of obese people, that's not because they're following the nutritional guidelines. They are not. And we have to look at this through the lens of the microbiome because as you'll learn, and as we previously mentioned, if you take something, say, like a whole grain and you kind of ultra process it and put it into like a bread, that's not necessarily going to make it into your microbiome because it's not within a food matrix. It's not going to make it to the colon, so it's really not going to have a beneficial impact on your colonic microbiome. We're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss why these ultra processed foods tend to be problematic and other reasons, and this review covers this in depth based off of the components of these individual foods and how they affect our microbiome and thus our health outcomes. So our first tale of the tape, they kind of look at the difference between whole plant foods, and you could throw in whole animal foods in there as well. It's just important to point out that animal foods tend to be a little more bioavailable than plant foods to us. And it's going to compare those to ultra-processed foods. And what do we see? What are the primary differences between these things? How are they different in respect to how they would affect the microbiome? And additionally, what we are delivering to the colonic microbiome. So when we look at whole plant foods, they're generally high fiber. High fiber is great. We do not, fiber is not bioavailable to us, and we are wholly dependent on our microbiome to access the energy and some of the nutrients in a high fiber diet. They contain phytochemicals, specifically things like polyphenols, which are going to impact the colonic microbiome because we don't absorb them very well either. They're not very bioavailable to us, so they're going to make it into the colon intact. And they're in a food matrix. So let's say we take something like polyphenols. Polyphenols are more bioavailable to fiber because we can break down food and get access to these phytochemicals. Generally speaking, they are not absorbed well, but they are absorbed better than high fiber foods. But when they're in a whole food, they're in a food matrix, so they're released more slowly, so less is absorbed by us and more is delivered into the colonic microbiome. We're delivering these nutrients to the colon because we are simply not accessing them, and some of them are not bioavailable to us, even if they were. But then we make a shift to ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are low in fiber. You could add fiber, but even if you add fiber, it's not going to be part of a food matrix. So it's going to be available to members of the microbiome that live in our mouth, that live in our stomach, that live in our small intestine. They're also high sodium. A lot of people say it doesn't matter how much sodium you intake, and most people, as it pertains to blood pressure, that is absolutely true, but it's important to understand why sodium is put into processed foods. Sodium is put into processed foods because it's a preservative. It prohibits microbial growth, and that's not necessarily a good thing for your microbiome. Going to impact the oral microbiome, the gastric and the small intestinal microbiome more than a colonic microbiome. But it's important to point out that sodium is going to get into your colon. And so if you have high levels of sodium, that is potentially going to inhibit bacterial growth there. Additionally, we have additives that we add to these ultra-processed foods that make them more enjoyable or make them have longer shelf life. So when we look at things like preservatives, preservatives are there, again, to prevent microbial growth. So if we don't absorb these preservatives, they're going to make it into the colon, and they could potentially inhibit the growth of healthy bacteria in the colon. Emulsifiers, a little different problem here. We have seen, based on some evidence, that emulsifiers are potentially problematic. They can thin out the mucus layer and have a negative impact on the microbiome. It's important to point out a caveat here that a lot of the times they're taking these emulsifiers and giving you way more than you would ever get in your diet, things like carboxymethylcellulose or polysorbate 80. But in general, these emulsifiers, they are packaged in ultra processed foods anyway, which have other negative aspects to them. So it's important to identify that emulsifiers, questionable. As a general rule, they do seem to have negative effects on the colonic microbiome. The question is, if you only have some processed foods, is this a big problem? More than likely not. If all you do is eat processed foods, could you potentially deliver enough of these emulsifiers to your colon? Absolutely. And finally, one of the key aspects of ultra-processed foods that make them, I wouldn't say unhealthy to the microbiome, but not necessarily healthy to the microbiome, is that they are acellular. They are not in a food matrix. They are broken up so that we can access them. So if it's something we can absorb, we more than likely will absorb, unless we have a limited ability to absorb that nutrient. So they're acellular. So if we look at a plant, there are nicely organized cells. You have to break through those not only those cellular membranes, but you also have to break through the fibrous structures and the stalks and the seeds and the leaves. But when we get to processed foods, all of that is broken up, so all of that stuff is accessible. You don't need to break it down, so it's not time released, and less of it's going to be available to the microbiome. Here we have a wonderful chart from the review paper showing you how whole plant foods affect your gut microbiome and kind of the steps to get there versus processed foods. Again, you're looking at, with whole plant foods, you're looking at whole food matrices, dietary fibers, and phytochemicals, not very bioavailable to us, get delivered to the colon. What do these things do? Phytochemicals can do a lot. They can lower the pH, which is going to regulate what microbes can grow, decreasing the number of pathogenic bacteria that can live there. They're also going to regulate the amount of oxygen that's in the intestine. Again, that's going to impact what types of bacteria live there. They're going to decrease the inflammatory response, and they're going to have beneficial effects on kind of killing cancer cells. With dietary fibers, we're going to see the production of short-chain fatty acids, which increase the amount of mucus that is there, that prevents against leaky gut by increasing barrier function, and prevent bacteria from actually getting close to the intestinal barrier where they can cause inflammation and problems. You're also going to see beneficial impacts on inflammation and other aspects of the immune system. And being in a food matrix, you're going to see changes. You're going to get changes in digestive enzymes and things of that nature, and you're going to release them more slowly in the body. It's going to regulate things like hunger, how rapidly these foods are absorbed into the gastrointestinal tract, so they're going to regulate glycemic control, the amount of fat you absorb and how long it takes for you to absorb that fat, and inflammation. This is all going to decrease chronic disease risk. But when we look at processed foods, it's different. You have these highly bioavailable, completely acellular nutrients that are going to just be absorbed mostly by us. You're going to have to eat a lot of them for any of them to get to the microbiome, and they're going to lead to unfavorable changes in the microbiome, increasing inflammation, altering immune function. And since they're so rapidly absorbed, this is going to have a negative impact on things like hunger, how much food you eat, insulin sensitivity and glycemic control, and inflammation. The emulsifiers are going to have an impact on barrier function. They can decrease the amount of mucus so bacteria can encroach upon the intestinal barrier and induce leaky gut, and even create bad metabolites that we can absorb. And then finally, salt, generally speaking, is going to have a negative impact on the growth of bacteria, specifically lactobacillus, which are beneficial microbes. There's going to be, with this whole kind of thing that we get, the changes in the microbiome, the lack of short-chain fatty acids because of the lack of fiber and the lack of nutrients. The pH within the colon is going to be different. Oxygen diffusion is going to be different. In other words, the oxygenation is going to be a much more aerobic, oxygen-containing environment, and pathogenic bacteria in general are the ones that are aerobic. So you're going to have more pathogenic bacteria in there, less of the beneficial anaerobic bacteria, more inflammation, not only in addition to the lack of phytochemicals, but additionally to some of the metabolites created by consuming processed foods. We're going to have an increased risk of cancer within the colon and throughout the body, and an increased chronic disease burden overall. Now, tail of the tape number 2, the second comparison is the recommended foods versus the not recommended foods. The recommended foods, yes, fruits and vegetables, but also fatty fish, low-fat dairy, leaner cuts of meat, things of that nature, versus red meat, high-fat dairy, and processed meat. We're kind of look at the tail of the tape here. What's going to happen if you do consume enough of these foods to make it to the microbiome? So with the recommended foods, these are already microbiome targeted delivery. Again, less bioavailable to us means more bioavailable to them. It's going to get there. We also want to look at things like fermented foods, which contain pre, pro, and postbiotics. If you don't know what those are, we kind of covered those in a short video. You can click on the eye in the upper right hand corner of this video. We'll send you to that video in the card so that you can see what that is. And generally what we see is a decreased inflammation, and in terms of what's going on in the microbiome, primarily carbohydrate fermentation. The microbiome is fermenting carbohydrates, creating short-chain fatty acids, feeding the other microbes that are there, feeding a healthy intestinal barrier, and creating health within us from these metabolites from carbohydrate fermentation. But when we look at, high red meat diet, high fat dairy, processed meat, we get an increase in toxic byproducts. Most of these byproducts are associated with colon cancer. We're talking about things like secondary bile acids, iron, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia. These are going to generally increase inflammation. They're going to promote breakdown of the intestinal barrier. And what we're going to see is, when we're kind of focusing on these foods, we're going to see more protein fermentation. That's going to depend on what you're eating. That's not to say that you should not eat these foods, but if you were to just eat these foods, you would kind of primarily see most of these negative effects. A lot of this can be offset by making them a lower component of your diet and focusing more on the recommended food. So let's kind of get a look at what happens in the colon environment when we're delivering high amounts of either of these foods. So again, we know these high fiber, high phytochemical foods such as vegetables and fruit, whole grains, and even plant-based protein foods such as nuts and seeds and legumes. You're going to get a lot of phytochemicals, a lot of dietary fibers, some unsaturated fatty acids. This is going to alter your microbiome in what is perceived as generally a beneficial way. You're going to see these the microbiome change these phytochemicals, which actually then make some of them more bioavailable to us. And it also kind of increases the diversity within the microbiome, and there are some beneficial effects of these phytochemicals. Some of them are antimicrobials. They prevent the growth of pathogenic bacteria, or they feed other bacteria that then create environmental conditions unfavorable to the growth of pathogenic bacteria. Again, dietary fibers, you're going to see microbial fermentation of these dietary fibers. Important to point out as well that having phytochemicals packaged with these fibers is going to actually increase the production of short-chain fatty acids. Also important to point out that if these foods are contained in a food matrix, in the leaves, stems, nuts, or seeds of a plant, they're going to get delivered to the colon with other nutrients, things like, say, amino acids such as tryptophan, or different minerals that the microbiome is going to use to make these byproducts. Their kind of metabolism is similar to ours. They require certain nutrients to metabolize different kind of foods. So it's important that we're also delivering these nutrients to the colon as well, these micronutrients, these minerals. This happens when you're kind of eating foods in a food matrix. You're delivering everything, kind of the whole package package to the microbiome in the colon. Fatty fish, we're going to see kind of a higher intake of omega-3 fatty acids, which generally have a beneficial effect on both gut and systemic inflammation. And when we're looking at low-fat fermented dairy products and other fermented foods as well, we're actually delivering live bacteria, which contain the pre, post, and probiotics, getting them into the colon, increasing microbial diversity. So this is kind of a way, if you don't have the microbes that you need, fermented foods is one way, at least based on the data we have, that you actually can increase this diversity. Important to point out, if you stop consuming the fermented foods, that you're going to see a return to the previous state. So these are things you have to consume all the time. You can't just decide, hey, you know, I want to build a healthy gut. I'm going to eat some fermented foods. I'm going to add fish to my diet. I'm going to increase fiber and phytochemicals, and then I'm going to go back to the way I eat. The diet is going to adjust to what you eat, as will the microbiome. What do we see as potential negative effects of consuming things like red meat, high-fat dairy products, and processed meats? You're going to get delivery of undigested protein into the colon. Going to depend on how much you eat. If you eat nothing but red meat, which most people don't do, so it's kind of neither here nor there, you're going to get the delivery, eventual delivery of what you can access. This is going to increase things like ammonia. Ammonia is in the chemical formula, has nitrogen in it. Protein is the only thing that has the only macronutrient that has nitrogen in it. So the more of that you eat, you're going to get these compounds such as ammonia and N-nitroso compounds, which cause an increase in damage, oxidative stress in basically everywhere, but we're focusing on the gut. You're going to get precresol, which is a negative byproduct of, again, amino acid fermentation. Hydrogen sulfide. So meat proteins, animal-based proteins are higher in the sulfur-based amino acids than plant-based proteins. So when they get into the gut, if you eat enough of them, you're going to have a high amount of hydrogen sulfide. This breaks down the mucus layer. Also delivering heme iron, which is, kind of more prevalent in red meat than the other meats. You're going to see increased inflammation, increased carcinogenic response, because in addition to increasing inflammation, you're also increasing oxidative stress, and you're not delivering compounds that potentially negatively or potentially positively impact this, such as dietary fiber, or phytochemicals, fatty fish, and things of that nature. Important to point out that if you do consume those beneficial things, they can effectively eliminate all the negative aspects of consuming red meat. So it's just red meat in isolation is bad. Red meat as a kind of component of an overall healthy dietary paradigm is good. What about high-fat dairy products and processed meats? Here you're delivering high amounts of saturated fats, potentially, again, proteins. And if we're looking at processed meats, you're looking at nitrates, which can, again, make it down into the colon and form these N-nitroso compounds, which are negative for us. They're not good for our overall health. There's a ton of data on that. I think there is a gray area with, red meat. If you're overall healthy, do you really need to kind of limit red meat? Potentially, based on the studies in the microbiome, but it's a kind of an absolute that processed meats are not something you should be consuming on a daily basis. So what are the negative impacts of these high-fat dairy products and processed meats? Well, based on the high saturated fat content, they're going to increase bile acid output. The types of microbes they're going to attract are going to be more bile tolerant. They're going to be more likely to produce secondary bile acids, and these are inflammatory and promote cancer when they're in high levels in the colon. The kind of microbial fermentation of the undigested protein and the amino acids there within are going to cause the same issues that we see with high intakes of red meat: more ammonia, more precresol, more hydrogen sulfide. Again, you're going to break down the mucus layer, and you're going to be delivering higher levels of inflammation and higher levels of oxidative stress to the gut. And of course, these N-nitroso compounds from processed meats, again, these are going to increase oxidative stress. So the whole reason why we recommend limiting these things is that they have kind of a history of being bad in the human outcome data, being bad based on mechanistic studies, and overall, if your diet is, based mostly on these things, that's not necessarily a good thing. You want a diverse diet that contains some of these other protective components. In fact, your diet should mostly contain the foods that have the protective components so that you can then enjoy lean red meat, high-fat dairy products from time to time, and help kind of protect against the negative effects of having these things in your diet. A lot of people, if you look at kind of how people at least in the United States, follow the nutritional guidelines, they're eating nothing in the protective column, and they're focusing more on things that are not necessarily good for them. Let's jump into what all of the data shows, the human outcome data, the mechanistic data, and how we can kind of get a more clear picture of how we can build a healthy gut microbiome, how we can get our gut bacteria to improve. So based on everything we know, whole plant-based foods are what is feeding our microbes. They are delivering nutrient packages to the colon. They're getting our microbes the nutrients that they need, and not just the individual nutrients that we think they will metabolize, what they need to actually metabolize those nutrients as well. Current processed foods should be limited. I say current processed foods, and we should kind of delineate between ultra-processed foods and processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are different. They have basically zero food matrix, whereas, even cutting food is sort of a process. So there's a difference between ultra-processing food and just doing some simple processes like, cutting food, or, fermenting food is a process as well. It's certainly considered a process that we need to consider, but, clearly processed meats are different. They're fermented meats. They're completely different than processed plants that are fermented, such as sauerkraut and kimchi, and even processed dairy products such as kefir. So the current processed foods that we have are not really that good. They are meant to taste good. They're meant to have good mouthfeel. They're really not targeted to help your microbiome, although there is kind of a transition going on with that. We can, in theory, produce processed foods that are healthy for us if we include the things we need, but ideally, we want these foods in a food matrix, so processed foods in general are not going to be optimal, but there is certainly a way to make processed foods healthier for the microbiome. We just really don't have that yet. I think that that's probably coming in the future. Even when we're looking at these kind of currently plant-based meat alternatives, these are ultra-processed foods. These are not things I would recommend people eat, certainly not over whole foods. I probably wouldn't even recommend swapping out meat for these foods. You want to look at things different. You want to look at the overall pattern and not single nutrients. That's where we get into trouble. Specifically when we're looking at the microbiome, we want to look at the entire dietary pattern and not single nutrients. I think when we're looking at these highly processed plant-based proteins, that we are not taking this into consideration. I think we have to look at things differently. We have to look at things like meat as being for us. The protein is more bioavailable. If you generate enjoyment from meat, you don't necessarily need to take it out of your diet. If you have an ethical stance against consuming meat, that's great. That's your opinion. By all means, eat how you want. But for the most part, I would look at meat as being for us, being to help us absorb some proteins and some other nutrients which may not be contained in vegetables. And the fruits and vegetables, at least large portions of them, for our microbiome. We're delivering nutrients in a food matrix that we don't absorb, that is not bioavailable to us, to our microbiome. So we have these two things, and it's important to have both in our diet, at least based off of what we know now. I don't think there's strong evidence that a completely vegan diet is the best diet for health outcomes, and I don't really see a major difference between the idea that a vegan diet is optimal and a carnivorous diet is optimal, because we are neither herbivores nor carnivores. We are omnivores. So ultimately, based on the current data, that is what's best for us. So it's important to point out, we are relying a lot on outcome data. We are relying a lot on mechanistic data. It's important to have some human data to kind of say, how do you go from point A to point B? How do you go from these foods lead to a healthy health outcomes, and These foods lead to healthy microbiome outcomes. We do need some human data to kind of support this. And we do have that. There is a paper from, I believe, in 2014 called Diet Rapidly and Reproducibly Alters the Human Gut Microbiome by Lawrence A. David et al. And what they found was just 5 days of switching from a mostly plant-based diet to a mostly animal-based diet rapidly changes the microbiome in a way. So going from consuming a mostly plant-based diet leads to kind of what we see when we see the mechanistic data in the human outcome diet data based on diet. We see that these generally lead to beneficial effects overall. They definitely lead to changing the microbiome in a way that's going to create the metabolites that are associated in the mechanistic studies with a healthy microbiome. Additionally, when we switch to a mostly meat diet, we're going to see a lot of these organisms that are associated with higher inflammation, colon cancer, and cardiovascular disease. So we do have human data kind of showing us that this diet that leads to the healthier health outcomes is also going to change the microbiome in a way that should theoretically lead to healthy outcomes, and vice versa. The high intake of the things that negatively impact health outcomes also negatively impact the microbiome. The overall conclusion of this review paper is that the food recommendations, while leading to healthy outcomes, do generally seem to promote a healthy gut microbiome. And this is supported by both the outcome and mechanistic studies. Following a healthy dietary pattern long-term is going to lead to what is considered a healthy gut microbiome and the beneficial byproducts of metabolism by the gut microbiome that promote health within us. Now, that being said, it's important to point out that there may be exceptions. A low-carb diet, a ketogenic diet, these could be exceptions to the rule. Certainly, you don't have to eat a diet that is against these recommendations following a low carb or a ketogenic diet. You can follow a low carb or ketogenic diet and eat plenty of low bioavailable plant foods, certain things like avocados. There are certain things you can eat within both of these diets that make you fall within what is considered the national health guidelines. Carnivore, not so much, but carnivore is kind of going through a transition right now, whereas the carnivore diet used to be entirely meat-based. Now you have certain sects consuming fruits, berries, things of that nature, which are going to deliver the phytochemicals, the fiber, and get them into the gut. Certainly a carnivore diet is beneficial in that you're not going to see any of the food additives. You're not dealing with the many negative aspects of a highly processed food diet. But we don't know what's going to happen long-term eating a carnivore diet, particularly if you're not adding in things like fruits. We don't know what's going to happen long-term. It's potential that it might be beneficial long-term. Low-carb and keto diet, any diet that kind of leads you to get to a healthier weight is going to promote health versus a diet that does not. But what does this mean long-term? We have absolutely no idea. Based on the mechanistic studies and the outcome studies, it's not good for carnivore, but we can see studies, we can have studies on these diets now that people are consuming them, and we can see what happens when people consume these diets long term on health outcomes and the gut microbiome. But this brings us to a question. What if following the food recommendations makes you ill? There are people that this is a problem for. This is one of the reasons why they generally kind of flow into the low carb, keto, or carnivore camps. They're eating things that they're causing gas and bloating, making them feel poorly, negatively impacting their mood, and making them sick. So, it's important to point out that you shouldn't force yourself to eat foods that are not right for you simply because they may lead to better health outcomes. It's important to figure out what works best for you. This leads us to a wonderful paper which was just published in Clinical Nutrition, and it kind of tells us that what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. You cannot assume that what's good at the population level will be good for you as an individual. Individual mileage may vary. Some people may do very well following the nutritional guidelines to a T. Some people may do well only following partial aspects of the nutritional guidelines. Some people could even theoretically do better not following them at all and just kind of blindly following their own thing. The recommendations are not for everyone. They're just what is generally healthy for the overall population. And this brings us to the study, differential hydrogen sulfide production by a human cohort in response to animal and plant-based dietary interventions. We're looking at hydrogen sulfide, kind of just a recap. Hydrogen sulfide has a lot of negative effects on the gut. Specifically, it can thin out the mucus layer. At low levels, hydrogen sulfide is actually beneficial. At high levels, it can actually prevent your gut from metabolizing the short-chain fatty acid butyrate, which is the primary fuel source for colonocytes. This can lead to leaky gut, inflammation, breakdown of the intestinal barrier, and things of that nature. So what they found in this study is, generally speaking, in most people, a high animal protein-based diet is going to lead to increased hydrogen sulfide production. They fed people animal-based protein diet intervention and a plant-based diet protein intervention. And what they found was that, yes, in general, animal proteins led to more hydrogen sulfide production. However, in 2 out of the 11 individuals, the plant-based dietary intervention did not. It actually either kept the hydrogen sulfide production the same or even increased it. This is not a good thing. So here we have a clear picture of where 18% of the people in this study, if they followed the the dietary guidelines based on human outcome and mechanistic observations, they would actually increase their hydrogen sulfide production. And this probably would be accompanied by negative health outcomes. You would probably feel this. And so these people, hey, generally speaking, in the population, you should kind of get a little more plant-based proteins, and those will be beneficial. In this study, they found that in 18% of people, that was not the case. That is not a good thing. I would not recommend people kind of follow the guidelines to a T. In this situation, you would probably want to back off the plant-based proteins and kind of focus more on the animal-based proteins. Again, this is something you're going to have to try out for yourself. Fortunately, we don't really have access to testing that's going to tell you this. You can look at some of these microbiome testing tests. Problem is they're really not validated, but you can certainly see an increase in hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, and some of the more advanced tests can look at biomarkers from the microbiome. So just the important thing to take home from this study is that what's good for everybody isn't necessarily good for you. This brings us to the conclusion. How do we get our good gut bacteria to improve? And that is find a diet that works for you. Start with a decent framework. Some people are going to be able to just take a Mediterranean diet. Maybe there are a couple things in there that kind of give them gas, they don't make them feel very well, they can take them out. Some can just follow the nutritional guidelines and kind of take things in and out as they like. Some other people, maybe you have IBS or some other problem, and a short-term restriction diet for 2 to 3 months, carnivore, a low FODMAP, things of that nature, a low histamine. You can follow that for 2 to 3 months, but the important part is whether you take Mediterranean, whether you take the nutritional guidelines, whether you take carnivore, whether you take low FODMAP, the important part is to not just sit on that diet and focus on it. Take things out, add things in, see what works best for you. If you're doing a low FODMAP diet, let's say, maybe you're going to want to add foods that are unlikely to cause your issue. So certainly you wouldn't want to just start increasing higher FODMAP foods. You would take foods that are higher in fiber that contain few FODMAPs, and then you could eventually try foods that are, higher in FODMAPs that you may tolerate. It's not. FODMAPs are a broad range of things. They're multiple different types of carbohydrates. So it's important to point out that while you may react to some high FODMAP foods, you won't with others. If you're doing a carnivore diet because, vegetables just simply don't agree with you, I would start with adding fruit before I would start adding vegetables, simply because they may make you be better able to tolerate fiber and phytochemicals if you're using fruit versus if you're using vegetables. Also important to point out that probably one of the best things you can add, especially if you're trying to increase gut diversity, gut microbiome diversity, is fermented foods. So adding those into your restriction diet when you can actually help you tolerate other foods, at least based on the theoretical concepts of what the gut microbiome does. Overall, if you can, you want to consume an assortment of fermented foods, high fiber foods, and high polyphenol foods. Based on the data that we have, these are the foods that are going to drive a quote unquote healthy gut microbiome, and they're all associated with better health outcomes in humans. Based on all of the evidence we have, looking at what is going to shift your gut microbiome to a healthy gut microbiome, we do not have good evidence for probiotic supplements. Certainly there are studies showing that these things can help with things like depression and other things, but there is no good evidence that taking a probiotic supplement is going to increase the diversity or promote a healthy gut microbiome. Fiber supplements or supplemental prebiotics, there's conflicting data on these things. They are possibly inferior to food, certainly based off of the fact that they're immediately bioavailable. They could be feeding microbes far sooner up the chain, things in your mouth, in your stomach, in your small intestine. So you are increasing the risk of having an overgrowth of bacteria in an area where they should not be overgrown. And they're also not packaged with the other nutrients and minerals that they need. So, we have fiber, prebiotics packaged within food. And then, if they're packaged in a seed that doesn't get opened up until it gets into the colon, the microbes have everything they need. If you take a supplemental, a fiber supplement, you're just providing the fiber. You're not necessarily giving them the minerals they need or the micronutrients they need to process that fiber. That's not going to lead to better outcomes. It's not going to lead to even comparable outcomes. So there is no evidence that fiber supplements are great for kind of promoting a healthy gut microbiome. Certainly there is evidence that they do lead to the production of some of the metabolites, but overall, fiber supplements are not something I would rely on. And the newer postbiotics, things such as tributrin, or these are effectively delivering the byproducts of microbial fermentation to the gut. We don't even know if they get there. Sure, the marketing materials say, hey, we package this in a capsule that won't release it to the colon. This is not studied by any of the companies who make these products. It's just assumed that is happening. These could be opening up far sooner than they know. We simply don't know. So for example, if you want to get butyrate to your colon, the only way we know to do that is by consuming fiber, whether it's in a supplemental form or in food form. But we have no idea if consuming these postbiotics is getting things like butyrate into the colon where we need it anyway. That's not to say that probiotics, fiber supplements, or postbiotics may not have a beneficial effect overall on your gut. There is no evidence that they are going to substantially impact your gut microbiome in the colon. And finally, don't forget the things that we've discussed in other blogs that you can check out at www.hackyourgut.com, and things that we've discussed in videos that we've produced. You need good oral health. Basically, the bacteria, as we mentioned, the second most bacteria on your body is in your mouth. You are swallowing that bacteria, so that bacteria is seeding the other microbiomes within your gastrointestinal tract, and there are definitely correlations to some of these oral bacteria making it into the colon and being associated with colon cancer and IBD, specifically Fusobacterium nucleatum. Good evidence that is making it from the mouth into the colon and causing a negative effect. Candida albicans as well. There's a study showing that good oral health by brushing 3 times a day actually substantially by 10 to 100-fold decreases the amount of Candida albicans going through your digestive tract. Getting good sleep, tons of evidence that sleep affects the gut microbiome. Managing stress. Stress impacts both the gut microbiome as well as intestinal permeability. Getting regular physical activity and maintaining a healthy weight. Again, click the I in the upper right hand corner to go to the videos where we discuss these things. We don't want to cover them here because we've already kind of pushed upon an hour. So thank you very much for listening in. If you guys try this stuff out, let us know how it goes. If you have questions or comments or constructive criticisms, put them in the comments section below. If you like this stuff, please share it on social media, and don't forget to like it on YouTube, as well as subscribe to the channel if you want to kind of get more videos like this and kind of get a lot of information on how you can build a healthy gut and a healthy gut microbiome. So thanks for listening into the presentation, and take care.